I think I've just recorded it.
Oh, yes, you are. You're starting already. Very good.
Yeah.
So again, welcome everybody to this first session of the Ecological Design course, 2019 edition. It's wonderful to have you on and wonderful to see so many people joining us today. We are recording this session because some people will not be able to make it due to their time zone or other busy things that come up in life, but they'll be able to watch the recording later if they wish to stay up to date with the course. And during this session, mostly I'm going to turn it over to Ezio and Jacqueline in just a second, but I just want to let everybody know that this is a good opportunity for any questions that you may have about the course, to clarify how do you complete your assignments, or any other questions that you may have. Ezio and Jacqueline will do a little presentation on the first module to get things going. So let me turn things over to Ezio right now.
Thank you, Gio, and welcome to all students, and especially to my co-facilitator, Jacqueline. So I'm really delighted to be co-facilitating with Jacqueline this year again. So just to kickstart off for this first module, the first module is really about the big picture, getting us to understand about climate change, peak oil, peak energy rather, but something else that we've seemed to have overlooked in previous years, which we're bringing into the live session, and which Jacqueline is going to expand on, is to show the importance of sustaining complex interdependent cycles within the Earth system. So this is an overarching theme throughout this ecological dimension. And then you'll see that from the thrust of this first module, we start introducing the whole systems design approach. This is the common theme throughout each module. So here we start seeing the impact of the big picture with whole systems design as an introduction. And then we delve more into it as we go module by module. So I'd like to hand over to Jacqueline for the next couple of slides. And Jacqueline, if you can just prompt me when you want to go from one slide to the other. So this is your second slide.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to do a team bit, and then I will turn over again to Ezio, who will do his bit, and we will together form a very productive duo that we so often do form. I posted something in the discussion forum a few days ago, a new topic. I posted actually 2 videos and a question. One of the videos was about Paul Hawkins' drawdown project, which you can see the cover of his book on the left-hand side of the screen. And Hawkins' book and his project is really all about drawing down greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in order to combat climate change. I also posted a TED talk from a climate scientist, Dr. Antonio Nobra, who worked at the Earth System Science Institute in Brazil. Now, Nobra has a slightly different approach. In fact, it's not really slightly different, it's completely the opposite to what Hawkins is talking about, largely because even though he's a climate scientist and he submits to the IPCC, he's also an Earth system science. So he's actually looking at things from a bigger picture and a different perspective. Now, I'm not going to read everything out because these will be posted in the virtual classroom, so you can always go back and read them and think about them and watch the videos. But what drawdown does is it looks at the need to take CO2 in particular out of the atmosphere what Nobra is talking about is he's talking about the Amazon as this massive, beautiful, biotic pump, which is pulling in air from the ocean and taking the rainfall and pumping it back into a river in the sky. And in doing this, it is providing water for the entire area of South America. It's providing irrigation. It's cooling the atmosphere. It's, in fact, changing the climate. It's changing the weather. It's creating trade winds and things like that. So his approach would be different to Hawkins' approach in drawdown. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So what exactly is this Earth system science? Well, it connects a great deal to what we used to call the Gaia hypothesis, created by Lovelock and the biologist Lynn Margulis, in which they postulated that Gaia, the planet, is a living, self-regulating organism. And since they postulated that back in the 60s, I think it was, it has now actually been transformed into science. So once again, I'm not going to read this big quote here from Professor Tim Lenton at the University of Exeter. I did his course in 2014, which was absolutely excellent. But what he's saying there is that this is quite a young science, but what's really important about it is that it's interdisciplinary, which means that they study the life sciences like biology and ecology, as well as physical sciences like geology, maths, and physics. Now, I've got a personal anecdote as to why I decided to tackle this way this week by posting that topic in the forum, by starting off the live session with this. And that's because in October, when the IPCC produced their latest report, which was, you know, very, very grim, I went to a meeting at the University of Edinburgh, which was organized by some engineers. The people there were mostly from technology, geoengineering, carbon management, that sort of thing. And what they were talking about was dealing with this through more technology, carbon capture and storage, and nets, which are the negative emission technologies, none of which actually exist at the moment. So I asked for the mic and I started talking about the potential to, for restoring ecosystems and the hydrological cycle, drawing down, sequestering carbon through regenerative agriculture and all of these things. And I actually got a round of applause from quite a lot of the students. But the engineers really weren't very impressed. And one of them said to me afterwards, "It's so good that you actually brought that up, because they are parallel crises, aren't they?" So I said to myself, what? No, they're not parallel crises. They're one and the same crisis. They're just different aspects of the same crisis. And if we're going to deal with this, we have to deal with both of them together. And that is really what the Earth system science people are saying as well. What they're saying is that it is the functional cycles of the planet which are actually producing the conditions which are conducive to life on this planet. And it's quite easy to see that, because in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a graph, and it shows you two things. On the left-hand side, you see the gases which are exchanging continuously on Earth, and you see what gases would actually be there if there were no life on Earth. So it's really very clear, as Lenton says, that it's the exchange of materials on the Earth's surface which shows without a shadow of a doubt that life itself is actually producing these exchanges, and therefore the conditions that makes life possible. And how does the planet regulate itself? Well, it does this in functional cycles. which are extremely important. There's the exchange of gases that I've just mentioned. There's the hydrological cycle, which is what Nobra is talking about. There's the carbon, the nitrogen, and the nutrient cycle. And of course, we learn about these in biology at school, if we do biology, but we're never actually made aware that they're anything but mechanical. So it's about whether or not the Earth systems are mechanical or whether they're actually living. And of course, we all say that they are living, that these happen because every single little living creature on the planet is taking part just by breathing, by eating, just by reproducing, just by defecating. They're creating these magnificent cycles that create the conditions which are conducive to life. Ezio, can you go on to the next one, please? Okay, and here are some of these cycles just as an illustration, because they organize themselves into ecosystems, as we probably all know. And we have on the right-hand side, we have the ecosystem that we find in the soil food web, in which everything takes part in recycling dead matter and even living matter by eating each other, fundamentally. On the left, we have the forest food web, in which we can see really that the plants are the primary producers, that they produce life by transforming solar radiation into a chemical process called photosynthesis. And by using that solar radiation, they split water and they take CO2 from the atmosphere to create carbohydrate chains. And the byproduct of that is actually oxygen, without which there would be no life whatsoever on this planet. So it is actually all of the plant life together on the planet which is really creating the oxygen which keeps us alive. And at the same time, it is providing the first level of food. It is the primary producer. So then the herbivores come along and eat the plants, and the carnivores eat the herbivores, and the omnivores eat everything. And this is how all of these cycles continue. So in actual fact, you know, if we want to protect life on this earth, which is also what we want to do when we're protecting it against climate change, we have to protect those functional biotic cycles. Can we have the next slide, please, Ezio? Yeah. Can you go back again to the first slide, my first slide? No, my first slide.
Oh, sorry.
I originally had two slides in here which were very similar, and Ezio thought that it would be much nicer to collapse them into one. So anyway, I want to go back now that I've explained that to this this question that I posed. You know, is the climate crisis and the ecological crisis something that's separate? You know, are they parallel crises, or is this a false dichotomy? Because what we see in the drawdown scenarios, which are absolutely excellent, but the problem is the greenhouse gas that's up there in the atmosphere, and it's all geared towards emissions and to getting them back and sequestering them. Whereas the other one, the life system science one, is really much more about restoring all of the life on Earth, all of the ecosystems, those living systems which are the functional biotic cycles. So the question rises, can we protect those functional biotic cycles by focusing on the emissions alone? Because it's not really the emissions that are causing problems with the biotic cycles. And then the bottom question, would an ecological approach, a whole systems approach, restoring the Earth's functioning cycles through life-affirming action, also combat climate change and draw down greenhouse gases while it is restoring the biosphere? Okay, can we go then further on to my other slide? That one, yes. So, Charles Eisenstein, of whom some of you will probably have heard, maybe many of you, has just recently published a new book, which is called Climate, A New Story. And he's dealing with this topic really in his book. And one of the things he says is that, you know, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. There's been life around on Earth for about 4 billion years. And, you know, it's actually managed to deal with some pretty sticky situations. What is it that makes the planet, makes it possible for the planet to survive under difficult conditions? And the answer to that really is it has healthy ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems will always in one way or another balance it out again. He also asked the question, you know, why, when we know that we can use regenerative agriculture, ecosystem restoration, restoring the hydrological cycles and everything, why we can actually use this to sequester carbon, are we actually still functioning, still focusing on emissions? And so that brings me to this slide, which is about the planetary boundaries. So the good news really is that we can restore ecosystems, we can restore the hydrological cycle, and we can actually use that to sequester carbon. The bad news is we're destroying all of those healthy ecosystems that we need to do it. And we're not destroying it really just through climate change. Climate change is something that is separate from our destruction of these ecosystems. And you can see that very clearly if you look at the planetary boundaries diagram, which was drawn up by Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Centre a few years ago. So there are 9 planetary boundaries that we shouldn't be transgressing. So far, there are 2 which are up there in the red zone, which is really high risk. It means that we've transgressed the boundary into a terrain. We really don't quite know what's going to happen. It looks like they might be heading towards collapse. And those 2 are biosphere integrity, genetic diversity, and the biochemical flows. And the third one is land system change. But funnily enough, climate change is actually a little bit lower than land system change. So it's actually, if you look at it from this perspective, it's not really as serious as these other boundaries that we've transgressed. So the genetic diversity, which is up there in the red zone, you know, that is about species extinctions and loss of biodiversity. What about the functional diversity of these cycles? Well, there's a question mark in there because there isn't really a load of data around which is making it possible to say how far we've gone. But that data is coming in more and more rapidly all the time, and scientists are getting quite frightened about this. 50% of European wildlife lost in 40 years. That means the small birds, small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates, and 75% of winged insects in 27 years. Now we're talking here about the biomass, which is the number within a species rather than the extinction of separate species. And that's actually quite frightening because, you know, those winged insects are extremely important because they are close to the bottom of the food chain and everything else depends on them. But also they're the pollinators, they're the pest control that we use in organic agriculture. The other very frightening statistic is the depletion of soil microorganisms, because they are absolutely fundamental to passing nutrients to plants in the soil. And that means that by killing them off, by eroding the soil, we're making it extremely difficult to grow food without artificial fertilizers. And it's those artificial fertilizers that are so dangerously close to damaging the biochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus, which are leaking into the atmosphere. In the sea, they're causing dead zones and that sort of thing. So, you know, what we can see here is that agriculture, industrial agriculture, is very, very seriously implicated in the destruction of the ecosystems that we need to keep those, those functional cycles turning over. That the land system change is also, that's about change to agriculture, changes within agricultural styles, but also urbanization, the growth of these huge cities and, you know, paving over everything, taking away the habitat and the forage for species. And also within that, of course, deforestation, which is linked to a lot of things, but also very much to agriculture. And there's a quote at the bottom from Chris Packham, who's, he's like a younger version of David Attenborough, a naturalist and a presenter. And he says, you know, our generation is presiding over an ecological collapse, and we're actually just not talking about it. It seems to be becoming normal. And so let's move on to the next slide. I've just put some stuff in here, you know, the links to articles that are coming into the press more recently, because it is becoming much better known that we're heading for what's called here an insect Armageddon. And farmyard birds disappearing, and of course the biodiversity on the one side is all about these iconic species like the polar bear and the elephant, on which we focus a great deal, or which our media focuses a great deal, but we're not really talking enough about the loss of the biomass in terms of the small mammals, the birds and the insects. Next slide, please, Ezio. Okay, so what have we got here? We've got a situation in which we know, if we are Earth system scientists and ecological designers, like you know we are, that we can do an enormous amount towards restoring ecosystems, and that way also combating climate change. Whereas if we just focus completely on CO2 emissions, we get ourselves into this almost paralysis, because we've been talking about emissions now for 30 years. And we don't seem to get anything done, because, you know, the emissions are still going up. And, you know, all the focus on emissions tends to be about telling people not to do something. Don't fly, you know, don't eat meat, don't drive too far, don't do this, don't do that, which creates terrible guilt and anger. People get angry with other people who fly when they've stopped. And you know, our governments are paralyzed. They don't seem to be able to talk their way through carbon budgets and stuff like that. So, you know, it seems to be a reasonable approach to just sort of say, let's stop worrying too much about the emissions and let's go 100% for this ecosystem restoration, for all of the regenerative design, for the regenerative agriculture, for the reforestation, for all of those things that can keep these functional cycles going. And at the same time, they will be drawing down, the sequestering carbon. There will be increasing biodiversity, because they're creating habitats for other living creatures on whom we depend. And, you know, the great thing about this is that when people get involved with the regenerative side of it, then, you know, they feel like they own it, they're part of it. It's such a positive thing. People will really want to protect those functional cycles and their ecosystems. They really want to start living life-affirmative lives again. So I think there's something to be said for this. And this is really what we are doing as ecological designers. We are creating these systems that are life affirmative, that are going to be regenerating our functional cycles. Just to round this part of it off, I wanted to really look at what we do as ecological designers from the perspective of the word ecology. You know, ecology is really about looking at systems as a series of relationships. And I have this beautiful tree here, and you can see all the different relationships that are going on in the tree. Australian Aboriginal people call a tree a waru, which literally means a network of mutually beneficial and supportive interrelationships. So what we're doing is we're looking at communities of interbeing. We're working with life. We're becoming part of the web of life as ecological designers. So I hope that inspires you enough to want to go on to really tackle ecological design, not just as something abstract, but as something which is extremely life affirmative and positive and hopeful for the future. Thank you. Take it away, Ezio.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I really echo everything you said, that all life is dynamic, and the exchange of energies were all in balance until humans overstepped their mark and put everything out of kilter. And this is where the era of the epoch of the Anthropocene has come about. And just a quote that I liked using up at the top there from Wolfgang Sachs. He says the world will no longer be divided by the ideologies of left and right, but by those who accept ecological limits and those who don't. So this environmental crisis, where the climate change is just one of the symptoms, poses big challenges on humanity. And these were finally we see the great awakening amongst the political leaders through COP21 and the adoption of the SDGs at the same year. And if you look at the built environment sector itself, its significant contribution towards the negative aspects of climate change, and you look at all the resources that it uses. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner there, the built environment uses 18% of the planet's fresh water, 25% of wood, 40% of fossil fuels, and 27% of energy generated. So if we can just look at how nature resolves a lot of these issues naturally in the ecosystems, we can learn so much by using nature's toolkit, as we will learn in each of the modules, to come up with very practical solutions that do no harm, but in fact start regenerating the whole planet. So that is our approach. We acknowledge these challenges, but we use nature's toolkit to guide us and help us come up with mitigating strategies. So, as I mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals was one of the outcomes of 2015. Towards the end of the year, most nations signed up for this, and all 17 SDGs are interrelated. But maybe we can extract or elevate rather Goal 13, which is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And if we look at the infrastructure-related aspects of this module, is Goal 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And this deals with water, basically, and cleaning up sewage, which is generally left to go out to sea. And ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So it's getting rid of the fossil fuels and bringing in the renewable energies. Goal 9 is building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. And Goal 11 is making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. These were just kind of some of the goals related to infrastructure that are pulled out. But there's others that we cover in this course as well, like zero hunger is all related to growing, providing for food security, and so forth. So there's quite a big focus on solutions for the SDGs in this course. That's what the slide tries to show us. And then just understanding the dire straits of the climate change challenge. There's this picture here on the top right-hand corner, which comes from the scientists, the IPCC, where they predicted what could happen by the turn of the century if we don't control things. We could have runaway climate change where we could have a 5-degree Celsius change in temperature. Now, if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, this is a picture, an image just from a few days ago. The parts per million is 409. This is what was measured at on the 11th of January. There's the web link. Every day it changes, but there's a noticeable upward trend. So this is one of the symptoms that's caused by not looking after the landscapes, not looking after biodiversity, and so forth, which Jacqueline alluded to. Now, you'll see these black swans around there. You might wonder what on earth are those pictures all about. But in project management or development management and also risk management, we talk of a black swan event. And the definition, a very basic definition, is a black swan event is an unpredictable event with catastrophic consequences. So, for example, Chernobyl was a black swan event. Fukushima was another one. 9/11 was another one, although that one was, you could say, it's self-inflicted. But be that as it may, it's these black swan events which are looming up on the horizon. We can see them, that they will manifest if we start going over the 2-degree mark. And so scientists have actually said we have to pull back and try and stay within a 1.5-degree maximum temperature rise from pre-industrial levels. So that meaning going back to what were temperatures like around about 1750 before the onset of the Industrial Revolution. We already, some scientists have said we're already at about 1.8 degree above that average from 1750. Whereas other scientists are saying, no, we're about 1.3, but they've all agreed that we should not exceed 1.5, at the most 2 degrees. And if we have anything more than that, we are in serious, serious trouble. That's just from normal climate change. Then with that, we need to understand what Jacqueline hinted about the Earth systems. It also looks at the circulation patterns and the biosphere components, and they're all interrelated. You know, if the Arctic ice melts, there's less reflection, there's more sunlight that gets absorbed by the ocean, which leads to a faster melting of the ice. And as it melts faster, it affects the jet stream. The jet stream is affecting all this horrific extreme winter climates that are in North America right now. And Geo is testing to that. He's retreated to the warmer Mexico. And eventually even the Gulf Stream itself, you know, that is starting to slow down. And we can just go back to the movie of 2004, The Day After Tomorrow. I mean, it's science fiction, but it's based on what would happen. What will cause the Gulf Stream to stop? You know, it's a sudden influx of ice into the North Atlantic, and we're heading that way. Anyway, these are just some of the interrelated tipping points that this research institute, the Potsdam Institute, has come up with. And just unpacking them a little bit more, you can see here the ice masses, and the loss of the Greenland ice, the collapse of the West Antarctic ice shelf, the shrinkage of the Tibetan glaciers. We're actually seeing all this happen, especially these methane emissions. And then the circulation systems, we're seeing the slowdown in the Gulf Stream, the drying out of the Sahel, and the ecosystem damage to especially the Amazon. The Amazon, the biotic pump of the Amazon is being weakened because of all the soybean farming that's been happening there and the logging. So these are the tipping points that we need to be aware of. But imagine if all these tipping points start to kick in all of a sudden. We'll have each one of these as a black swan. But can you imagine all of them hitting us at once? It's like a flock of black swan events. And this leads us to abrupt climate change. Some scientists are saying that things are changing far faster than what anyone would have predicted. And also what Jacqueline was introducing there with the Earth systems approach, my opinion is that there's a lot of very good climate scientists out there, but they're not holistic thinking. You'll find one will focus on methane, another one on the birds and the bees, and another one on the ocean circulation systems. But they don't have this holistic outlook that looks at all the systems and how they're impacting each other. That would be a real Earth systems climate scientist. But you know, looking at the trends here, we can see global temperatures are increasing, CO2 is increasing, and the ice is shrinking, and these are all black swans which are being accelerated. So cause for concern, but don't stress too much. We've got the answers. Just hang in here with us, and this is where we start introducing whole systems thinking. If we start realizing that how does nature operate? Let's mimic what we see in nature. And there's hardly any waste in nature. So the waste of one product or one system becomes the food of another. For example, composting. You put all the green waste in there and it slowly breaks down with the microbes and everything. Before you know it, you've got very good soil that you've rebuilt. So the waste of one, which is your kitchen waste, becomes food for your earthworms and so forth. So throughout this dimension, we try and illustrate examples of closing the loop. So you'll see the big circle there. Unfortunately, the color scheme of the PDF has played a bit of havoc with the colors there. But just see whole systems thinking as a circular system instead of a linear system. A linear system is typically you sit on your loo, you flush away, it's out of sight, out of mind, down a pipe, into the sewage works, and if you live close to the ocean, it's out behind the back line and you don't know about it anymore. That's a linear system. A circular system is that sewage is a major resource. If you put it through a living machine or a constructed wetland, you can clean it, you can use the solids to create methane, that generates electricity. So that is a closed loop system. And there's been a whole spate of closed loop system thinking approaches. You've got permaculture, which is inspired by ecology. You have ecological economics, which balances the four capitals of the natural capital, the built capital, the social capital, and the human capital. We've got restorative environmental design, which gives importance to place and biophilia. We've got ecological engineering, which tries to look at cyclical versus linear processes. We've got cradle-to-cradle design, which is upcycling, and the circular economy. This has been used very successfully in the motor car industry. And then you've got perhaps the pinnacle of all these is regenerative design, which moves beyond just sustainability. And this next slide is what regenerative development tries to illustrate, is that if you look at the graph, on the extreme left, you've got a degenerating scenario, and on the extreme right, you've got a regenerating scenario. So let's look at what causes degeneration. It's indiscriminate resource use. It's kind of efficient resource use, conservation resources. Then we start in the center here, we start striking a balance with nature. And we could say this is the realm of what we've been able to achieve with sustainable development, where input equals output, more or less. But we can go far beyond that. If we start mimicking nature and restoring nature and tending nature and becoming one with nature, we start moving through this whole upper spectrum, and eventually we become regenerative designers, or we have regenerative development. So this is the ultimate objective, is to try and achieve regenerative development, starting off at least with a benchmark of sustainable development. And you can see here the integration of human consciousness along this growth path. We start off with an anthropocenic approach, we become biocentric, and eventually integral. And one of the key things that we try and bring about is the whole systems thinking applied to a practical level through in the public realm and also the public sector. And how can we start influencing the public sector with this whole systems thinking? So you might be aware, those of you who work with the public sector, that the public sector is governed by national development plans that drill down to perhaps provincial plans, that drill down further to regional or district plans, and eventually right down to a local ward or local commune plan. And you might also have sectoral plans that cut across all this. Most countries have this type of planning structure. Now, how can we influence the planning authorities with what we do? So we need to place the Sustainable Development Goals right at the top of the pile now. They've never been there before, but they ought to be there now because these are global strategies that we need to impose. So we could say that from a top-down policies and strategies, we have the strategic thinking of the Sustainable Development Goals, national development plans, and so forth. But bottom-up needs analysis and solutions are the ecological design solutions that we come up with. And on the right-hand side are just some illustrations of what we've been doing on a large scale is moving towards a sustainable city using whole systems thinking and integrating utilities. And we'll touch more about this as we go into each module on water, food security, energy systems, and green buildings. So we will expand on it, but just get the important lesson that whole systems thinking can also be applied to the public sector on large systems thinking applicable to how we plan and manage our infrastructure. I'll give you an example. Often we'll see a landfill site, and if you don't have recycling in that particular town or that particular region, then everything goes to the landfill site. Organic, building waste, and so forth. Now, the organic waste in most countries is probably 30 to 40% of a landfill site's total mass or total waste. Now, as you compress that organic matter, it generates methane in time as it breaks down. And methane is up to 80 times worse than normal CO2. So why bother transporting the organic green waste to a landfill site, which fills up a lot quicker and produces methane, which is more harmful to the environment? This is a linear system. Whereas if you just do composting at source and you recycle, ideally you keep your garden, your kitchen waste at home for your own worm bin. You stop all this green waste going to the landfill site. You stop the CO2 and you start closing the loop. And I've seen many classical examples where you have a landfill site where everything goes there, and then you've got these green waste centers where people would bring their garden waste there, and from there it gets trucked to the landfill site. Why not have a composting station at these green waste cycles, and then stop the transport to the landfill site? In so doing, one can create jobs there. One doesn't need as much road transport to take with big trucks all this green waste to the landfill site, and so on. That's just one example, but there are many, many other examples like that. And so the type of thinking and our whole systems thinking that we need to inculcate is whatever we do, we must adapt to climate change. We have climate change adaptation and mitigation. And this diagram here just tries to illustrate the prerequisite for this is probably building or establishing an enabling environment. So this builds resilience and cuts carbon emissions. This deals mostly with policy. So here you have whole systems ecological design thinking that's embedded in how government thinks or how the private sector thinks. We can start influencing the green building standards. We can start looking at renewable energy policies and economic relocalization, smart inclusive growth, carbon taxes, energy descent planning instead of economic development plans, and natural resource protection. So these are all enablers. They create the enabling environment for the other two more hands-on practical things to happen. So under adaptation, this can be defined as local actions that minimize or prevent the negative impacts of climate change. And what are these typical activities? Well, let's get quite basic. We can retrofit buildings. We can develop ecological sanitation. We do rainwater harvesting. SUDS is all about sustainable urban drainage, renewable energies, urban greening, local organic food production. Then the mitigating actions, these are more large scale, or we could say global actions that reduce the emissions that contribute to climate change. So here we start looking at mass public transport, decentralized energy infrastructure, new green build, regenerative agriculture, carbon sequestration, and wilderness restoration. So this is the type of thinking solutions. And the very last slide is perhaps a bit of a wild card, so don't get too concerned with this particular slide, but we're showing you the long term, what can happen once you've finished all 4 dimensions. In a way, this is how you can start putting together a particular project in mind, focusing only on the ecological dimension. You have module 1, gives you the climate change perspectives or the base mapping. Module 2, you start learning about water supply and waste treatment. Module 3 is about your permaculture design. Module 4 is all about carbon neutral energy design. And module 5 is a green building design. If we consolidate all this, we come up with a consolidated ecological design. Putting this into an interdimensional integration, I'm looking forward to your case study in the what we call the design studio once you've done all 4 dimensions. So we can start thinking now, the theory that you're learning in all these modules, how can you apply it to a real life project that you might start thinking about now, how to do as a case study once you've finished all 5 dimensions. So this just gives you an idea of how we will be teaching you, or facilitating rather, how to compile your case study. So this is just an idea of how you'll be putting together the ecological design, but you would need to integrate this within the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the worldview dimension. So this is an exciting way forward for you to see how you can apply all this newfound knowledge from the ecological dimension moving forward. I think this is the last slide. So we're free to take some questions from here. I know that there may have been some overwhelming information coming through here, but as Jacqueline was saying, and Gia as well, it is being recorded, so you can download it and go through each of the slides yourself in more detail, follow the links and see where it fits in with what is in your manual and the quizzes and the reflections.
And you can always ask questions. Always, both of us were really happy to answer any questions. And of course, as well, I would really like to encourage everybody to take part in the discussions in the forum, because it means we get a much more lively debate going. We can stretch ourselves further. We get real co-intelligence flowing, in which we share our knowledge and get to know each other a good deal better too.
Yeah, I would really like to echo what Jacqueline was saying there. The optional activities, especially the ones where you come up with examples where you're living of closed loop versus linear systems. This is very important because this is the overarching theme of the ecological dimension. The module 1 gives you this broad overview of whole systems thinking. But as we move into each module, we'll zoom down to what is the water cycle, what is the agricultural cycle, what is the energy cycle, and so forth. So those are optional exercises are really nice to do and to learn from each other as a learning community. You know, how is energy supply in Switzerland compared to the Far East or South America or wherever the students are from? And you can learn so much from each other just by posting onto the online forums.
Has anybody got any general questions that you would like to ask now about Module 1?
I have a question. I'm curious to know how much kind of theoretical versus real world case study content will be throughout this dimension. This is all really great stuff. I'm interested to see how much of this gets applied in real world scenarios. And I'm just curious as to how much of a balance there is in this dimension.
Well, we can't exactly, unless you're involved with projects of your own that you apply the theory to, it would be very difficult for us to give you practical assignments. So
I guess what I was asking more along the lines of is, will there be examples alongside each of these? So great, that's awesome. That's great. That will be very helpful.
Examples in the real world as possible. Yeah.
Awesome.
And it's great if you actually find an example you think is worth sharing, then do. You know, this is
Absolutely.
how we get this co-intelligence flowing, which I like so much.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you.
I would also like to add there, Jacqueline, and to Tim, is that we've got a folder called Additional Resources or Facilitators Handouts. I think that's what it's called. And from time to time, we will upload their documents which can just expand on the course, especially examples. That's what we usually post there. But you're really encouraged to identify local examples around you that may already have been well underway and that you now recognize, oh, there's a sustainable intervention. And
Sure.
you could feed back to the forum about how it's been done in your area.
And I like also to add, Tim, that's a very good question and a good suggestion. And also, what Ezio was mentioning, there are additional resources under each module that relate to that module. But your question makes me think, wow, you know, as you're reading the theory, you may be curious about a particular thing that you are reading, and then it would be the time to post in the forum or ask one of the facilitators if they can give you an example where that particular thing is being applied. Like, because there's so many topics, you know, it's kind of hard for us to provide case studies for all of them. But if you're interested, for example, in how to clean black waters, then you can ask one of the facilitators, do you have an example of where this is being applied the way it is described in the text?
Great. Thanks very much, Joe.
And then, you know, also if you look at the content of Module 1, which is really at I'd say at a policy level or strategic planning level, to see examples of this embedded in the public sector, it has not been that easy. But I did a webinar for Gaia Education in December where I showed how we were trying to apply this in the public realm. And to try and convince civil servants is not always that easy. So half the presentation was actually on examples using the concept of ecological economics, which makes more socio-political sense rather than going to talk to the public sector about regenerative development. They won't understand that. So I try to pitch it at a level which they could understand by some real practical examples. So a lot of those examples on ecological economics, I'll upload just those contents onto the facilitator's notes so you can see the application of specific examples in your own time in there.
Excellent, thank you.
I wonder if anybody else has any questions.
I have a wish that I would like to put out to Ezio and Jacqueline that's connected with what we've just been talking about. I think that for those of us who are not professional land scientists or geologists or don't have a formal education in landscape restoration, the first step really is getting a piece of land to work on. And that may take us already into the economic dimension, but I think it's when we talk about real world situations, I think all of us probably would like to get started with something and try it. I'm fortunate in Berlin that I and my family, we've gotten a Kleingarten with 650 square meters that we can start to develop permaculture on a small scale. But as Jacqueline's questions that she put in the forum that I read earlier today are very important, and we can recognize the importance of large scale restoration, but where do we start? It has to start with the piece of land.
Involved with it without having land. I mean, a lot of people on a very small scale just get involved in community gardens, but there is a movement now called ecosystem restoration camps. A lot of young people are getting involved in these, and you can start one in your own locality if you just join up with the movement, and you can use the resources to draw people to a particular project. So this is something which is evolving at the moment. And you know, it's quite a positive thing because it makes it possible for people to get involved in restoration without actually having the land of their own. And it's a group learning experience too, particularly for the young people who are getting involved. But there are a lot more of this sort of things, and we can give you a lot of examples of this when we get down to that part of the dimension.
I was going to add to Keith, in your Berlin situation where you might not have a lot of space, in module 3, we will definitely cover planter boxes. How can you start growing just a few basic vegetables on a balcony and very effectively? So we'll be giving those type of examples out as well.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
And I want to mention here, related to Keith's question, that actually, Keith, your question applies more to on the design studio, which is exactly where we are. You will be working on applying all the learnings from all 4 dimensions into a specific project. And at that time, we need to identify a piece of land and a location and all the resources available and all that sort of thing. So that would be a very hands-on design experience. But in the meantime, as you said, and Jacqueline, if you have some questions or if you have some possibilities where you are, then why not start applying some of these concepts?
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, there is actually a good permaculture group, I think, in Berlin, isn't there? You can do permaculture design certificates in Berlin itself.
There is the Prinzessin Gardens. That's a very nice urban garden, but when you travel around the region, there are a lot of lands that are underutilized. There are lands with industrial waste on them that could be redone. When I lived in Chicago, I was part of a group that was involved in prairie restoration, and that is encouraging the successor plants and the biodiversity to come back from old meadows that had been one-time farm fields or on industrial marginal land or even on old railroad right-of-ways. And that's a project in Chicago that's been going on for 30 years. And that I don't know of anything like that in Berlin, but I think that something like this would be, maybe it's like this restoration camp that Jacqueline is talking about.
There are a couple of people here.
I think Victoria wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I just missed the beginning. I'm not sure when our first assignment due. did we talk about that?
24th, I think, isn't it?
Is it? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Generally, all assignments are due before the next module begins. And if you're having difficulty doing that, then you should communicate with your facilitator to let them know that you'll be a little late. Okay. Anybody else have a question? We do, these sessions are usually scheduled for 1 hour long. And of course they are recorded. So if you missed anything, you can go back in the classroom to see the recording. But let's give a chance to anybody that may have still a question before we close this session.
Are we, excuse me, are we going to have the rest of 4 live sessions in the format of lectures plus like a short Q&A? Thank you.
Good question.
I'll let Jacqueline and Ezio answer that.
Yeah, I thought Ezio was going to answer.
Okay.
Yes, that's mostly the format. The way we've done it this evening, we do a live presentation with slides, and then we leave it open for questions. So you can come with any questions you have about the material too. If you've been reading the course material or looking at videos that we've posted, please just feel free to bring all of it into these live sessions, because it actually means we can look at each other face to face, which is so nice. Anybody else? Other question? Does that answer your question? I think that Ezio has disappeared. Ezio, are you?
No, I'm still here. I'm still here.
It's just so. Does anybody else have a question, or should we round it off?
I think we can...
Sorry.
This is Jim. I was just going to say, very much looking forward to collaborating with you all and learning from you all.
Yeah, it could be a really great way to learn, you know, if we just make all of that extra effort to be online and talk to each other online. And, you know, we can also make appointments to Skype. You can make appointments to Skype with each other. I mean, it's, I did this course years ago when it first started, and I had a whale of a time and met so many people from all over the world and just talked to people on Skype. And some of them are still my friends all these years later.
That's great.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up then, and we can stop the recording, and we can thank everyone for participating. And as Jacqueline was saying, please don't hesitate to call us, to contact us, or to post information. And we're really looking forward to the rest of this dimension.
Yeah, looking forward to reading your reflections as well.
Okay.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. We'll stop recording now.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.